So thank you very much, Stormy. Melissa and Anna could just come up and join me, and we'll have this fourth seat empty. It's right by the stairs. We're not in a classic fishbowl setup, as you might see, which is to say you should still, we'll have a microphone for you, but this discussion will live off of your participation. And we saw yesterday that when Stormy, after our opening remarkable, I think, early speech by Anu Bradford, went into the audience, I know that many of you have opinions. So again, please don't be shy to come and join us up here. Let me formally introduce my panel. And you saw just now in our discussion that we were kind of looking at the moments of dissonance. Ours has the bumper sticker on it, the stronger than ever. And you may have just come to a conclusion on whether or not that's the case, but we're going to probe that bumper sticker phrase with these two outstanding journalists. So let me introduce Melissa Eddy to you. Many of you read her. Many of you certainly read her here. For over 2 decades, she's de facto been an expert on Germany, coming to Frankfurt first for the Associated Press, and then switching very quickly to the New York Times, covers business and economics, but also politics and leadership, as we just heard. She looked, of course, extensively in her reporting at, well, should we say the end of an era with Helmut Kohl and then the end of another era with Angela Merkel. So please join me in welcoming Melissa Eddy to our panel. And Dr. Anna Sauerbrey has the great fortune of constantly being read on both sides of the Atlantic. She is now with the politics reporting team of ZEIT, but she was part of the editorial team of the Tagesspiegel. As such, was named in 2019 one of the local editors of the year for those people who consider the Tagesspiegel a local paper, which is odd because it's clearly a national broadsheet. But she also writes a regular column on Germany and Europe in the New York Times. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Sauerbrey. And of course, I've already advertised the book. I selfishly brought that because I want an autograph, so it's not just all for your benefit. But let's jump right in, and I want to keep it really broad so that you can come in and join us. We heard yesterday from DCM Clark, and I love this line, that when we argue, we make headlines. When we work together, we make history. And we've gone through this up and down phase over the last, 6 years, 2 years of the Biden administration, 4 years of the Trump administration, where this idea of stronger than ever sort of leaves kind of a dry aftertaste maybe in the mouth, because it still seems like we're putting things back together again, or maybe that the outside circumstances are squeezing us back together again. Now, the results are remarkable. We just heard that. Just if you look at the summer, just September, exports from Germany to the United States, 50% up year on year, strong economic exchange. The Americans undoubtedly as the indispensable power, as Marina was alleging, quote unquote, saved the German Zeitenwende militarily, but potentially also economically with its energy supplies, and LNG coming in across the Atlantic Ocean. So Melissa, are we stronger than ever? Is this an emotive thing or is this a practical thing?
Thanks very much. I was getting hung up on the ever because I was thinking of how long German-American relationships are, and I'm like, so we're supposed to, look over the arc of history. Are we stronger than ever? And somebody said, well, that's what makes it an interesting question. So I think we are stronger than I have seen it in my time here in Germany. So if we just reduce it to my little arc of history, going back to arriving here in 2000, I can remember the students in the street who were protesting the Iraq War, and Schröder standing up at a speech and saying, "We will not go to war in Iraq. We don't believe in this war, and we won't support it." And the break that happened after that in the transatlantic relationship, and so going over time, I think. If that was sort of a break, if we look at Ukraine, where, as the panel before us was saying, like up until the moment when tanks actually rolled across the border, I got as well the sense nobody in Germany actually thought that that was going to happen. And at the same time, as an economic correspondent, I'm watching Gazprom on Twitter openly trolling the Germans, saying, oh, historic lows of gas supplies today. And I'm telling my editor, you know, something is going on here, right? And so, like, there were so many signs that seemed to be missed. And the United States was seeing it. The Germans were somehow not able to see it. And once it actually happened, where that came together and met with, as you said, the economic response of the United States, and with tanks, I think it's very interesting because, you know, we saw most recently, Biden initially couldn't understand why it was so important to Scholz to have Abrams tanks going to Ukraine as well, right? Like, it made no logistic sense. They're bigger, they're heavier, you need these enormous teams to just run the things versus
they run on
the
jet
Leos.
fuel.
They run on jet fuel. Like, the list is long why the Pentagon is saying this makes no sense. And yet, finally, when the penny dropped that this is about something more than does this make logistic sense? Like, even if you send 2 of the things, you need them. And to me, that was sort of a closing of the circle of this realizing that, okay, we are able to understand each other in places where it may not make initial sense, but it's about this, you know, the Bündnis. It's about the mutual support and moving together. And on the flip side, the Germans have stopped complaining about the LNG gas being fracked that's arriving there. I mean, yes, you have a few, but it's sort of the understanding of the idea that, you know, there's a point where we can't be ideological about everything. We need to stay warm in the winter and, you know, bring it.
So, Melissa, you mentioned sort of the different nuances in the relationship, the sort of more practical undergirding of this relationship. And is that a consequence of the Trump years, of the pain of the Trump years? Madeleine Albright, may she rest in peace, said at a panel about 2 years ago at the height of COVID, she said, well, we finally have, now with the Europeans, she didn't mean the Germans specifically, a relationship on eye level, where we're really working as equal partners. And that was certainly the bid with which Joe Biden came into the White House. And then he immediately irked the Transatlantic partners with AUKUS and with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then there seemed to be a lot of work trying to repair what had sort of already gone down the river. Where are we now? Is this really this sort of practical, nuanced, constantly negotiated relationship, or is the undergirding of it still strong, such that it may be stronger than ever?
Well, I think it's right what Melissa said, that it depends on what you compare it to. And when you compare it to Schröder or to Merkel's beer tent speech moment where she said, we don't know whether this is ever going to be like before, we are at a very good moment. And of course, there's on both sides, I think, an awareness that things need to be repaired, things that were broken during the Trump years. And as you said, we are squeezed together by the necessities of this war and, of course, also by the relationship of China. But when I thought back to the first press conference that Scholz and Biden gave in February of 2022 when Scholz came to Washington and visited, and I've had another look at the readout from the press conference preparing for today. I think this would have been a good relationship in any case, without the history, without the global circumstances, because these two men, they just get along. They come from a very similar ideological and political background. When they first met, in his speech, Biden stressed that they had a very good conversation. He mentioned that he was struck himself how much they had in common. He mentioned Scholz's campaign claim of respect. They both want to cater to the lower middle classes. They both want to be presidents, as President Biden now stressed in his National Union address. They both want to cater to the working lower middle class. So they both come from the same perspective to the world. And I think that's a good part why their relationship works and why they can find policies of working together. And they have done so when Scholz was still Minister of Finance. He worked with the administration to come up with a global minimum tax, and that's exactly the direction they want to take.
So this is the time when you can start making your way to this empty chair right next to me. You can lift your hands, fingers, you can start shuffling forward. We have a microphone for you. Otherwise, I will mercilessly, I was at Harvard for 13 years, and we believe in the principle of cold calling. No one knows this better than Joe Nye. I will immediately start cold calling people. Okay, I'm going to bring up my good colleague from the Bertelsmann Foundation, Senior Project Manager, Mark Fisher, who runs our transatlantic efforts. And while Mark comes up here, because we've already segued into leadership, which I originally thought was going to be sort of our third rally, but because both of you have brought this up as nuance, Melissa, let me take it back to you because you cover economics. Before Scholz went to China, and that seemed to be a potential crisis for the transatlantic relationship that the Germans were putting on the table as part of course, this negotiation for Germany. These are very, very real issues. Abram Newman outlined this. I mean, the way that the German economy is linked into the Chinese production facilities, the way that German core industries, although much of that is shifting machine building, the IRA is actually fantastic for German machine building. No green transition without German machines, apparently.
What can we do without German machines?
There you go. But there are these really significant issues, and there was a lot of, and I know this for fact because Jens Plötner happened to be on my plane in October, going to the White House to speak with NSC colleagues and various other people in Treasury and Trade, to kind of explain why the chancellor chose not only to go to China and to go to China without President Macron, but to take a big business delegation with him. So for all the things I think that Anna has said, which are correct, there are some of these fissures, and they also have something to do with how leadership frames them. So can you reflect on that a little bit?
Well, I think, of course there are fissures. Any relationship will have them. I think it's a question of to what extent are we able to overcome them, and to what extent does each side bring enough goodwill to the other side to overcome them. And I think that's really obvious if you look at, the trade tariffs that we had under Trump, and now, the response of everybody in Germany was completely on the ceiling, right? Not necessarily wrongly, but in many ways there was so much emotion. And now if you look at the IRA, you have Habeck going over and he says, well, we had a nice discussion and there are differences and we're going to talk about them. And in fact, if you play it through your head and think, had the IRA been under Trump, would you have a leading German minister just, that calmly reflecting? China is another instance where, clearly the U.S. view of China and what the United States wants and needs from China is very different from what Germany wants and needs. And so I think the idea that Germany needed to explain that, because often in terms of, the previous panel was talking about where are these differences? We kind of think we're so alike. And even at times, you find at the highest levels that, the extent to which major German industrial powers, from BASF, and VW, and on down the line to also even smaller Mittelstand companies, rely on China to keep this export nation going, is not something that they can just pull the plug on overnight. And making that clear and being able to talk about it, I think it's interesting, and I think it's sort of. It's also interesting in a way that Germany is now owning that and taking it up and going to Washington and saying, we get what you're saying, but we can't do that because we have this need. And this is our need, and you need to hear it. Because it's a shift in a relationship which has often seen the United States as dominant, right, historically as well, for obvious reasons, and Germany as, responding to, and to be able to have the Germans, at least now economically, be able to place their own stake and claim their needs, I find is interesting.
Mark, you have a transatlantic initiative at Bertelsmann, also an intergenerational expert initiative, and you're looking mostly at these economic and trade questions and sort of the reality of renegotiating that relationship. So is it stronger than ever?
Perfect segue. It was exactly the point that I wanted to make. I'm chairing together with colleagues at Transatlantic Expert Group, and that deals very much with these issues. We have three baskets. We look at climate and digital technology. We look at green change. we look at general trade questions, and then we look at China. And as you just said, and whenever you have that, I wouldn't say infects, but it kind of like seeps into all the other debates, basically. And when we had our first meeting in November, we discussed all the other baskets of issues, but whenever I was the moderator, and China always came up, because it's the underlying challenge that drives so many of these developments. And that's exactly the point that I wanted to make. I mean, we are here at the Trade and Tech conference, so I'll immediately, of course, mention, and I would be surprised if I was the first, I wasn't here yesterday, the Trade and Technology Council. And for me, that's one example where the US and the EU, but also Germany as a driving force in the EU, try to address their common challenges in a new vehicle, because they understand, look, on WTO and multilateral fora, it just doesn't work. We might wish that it would work, but it doesn't. TTIP 2 was started as an initiative from the Chancellery. We heard it last fall, also from the Economics Ministry. I think in the US there's a little bit, I would say it's a realistic approach, saying like politically this is just, we can't do it right now, you can't get it through Congress. And I think in Brussels, actually, many people think the same way. That's why I was a little bit surprised to hear it from the German ministries. But so we're trying to do this through the TTC, but when you see what we have been able to deliver through this instrument yet, I think we are not where we want to be in this process yet. And I think part of this is that the US and the EU side understand this process, or want to use this process a little bit for different purposes, not completely at cost purposes, but for the US, underlying all of the 10 working groups, even though it's not named one time, I think in any one of the descriptions, it's all China. This is about China. All of these 10 different working groups that deal with trade questions deal with challenges that are posed by China's behavior since the last 20 years as a WTO member, by Chinese state capitalism, and by the effect that China has on the multilateral trading environment. Whereas the EU pretty clearly understands that this is the challenge, but also wants to look at this goes at this more as a technical process, where they basically want to solve bilateral questions between the EU and the US. And I think that's what keeps us from achieving what we need to achieve in this process. I mean, this is not finished yet. This is it hasn't been, when it goes for trade questions, it hasn't even been going on that long yet. So I want to give it all the chances that that I can, because both sides need this very, very much. But from this expert group that I was showing, one sentence came out again with the underlying challenge of China is, I think Europe, and also specifically Germany, are starting to go in the same direction as the US when it comes to China, and viewing the challenges that are posed at China, and viewing also the specific challenges that you just laid out that are different for Germany as a heavily export dependent nation. But, and that I like that metaphor, we're starting to go in the same direction, but the distance is still becoming larger between the US and Germany, because the US is going so much faster. And Germany can't go that fast because of the realities that you just named. So that's a challenge that we need to address, and these kind of challenges, that's why I'm kind of happy also that now our economics minister is in Washington. They need to be addressed at the highest level.
Yeah. Well, this is the beauty of a fishbowl. You prepare something, and then you entirely change the way that the conversation is going to go, because now we're on topic, which was going to be my third topic, and we're doing it first. Anna, let me go back to you on precisely this, and because we've been talking about the containing environment of the EU Tech and Trade Council. You know, Macron went to Washington for this first state visit, and it was all about the Inflation Reduction Act and the 8 billion French value that was going to be destroyed by the IRA, and, you know, made a lot of klaxons, as we would say in French. But, you know, all of us in the journalistic profession had already gotten the leaked conclusions of the December TTC meeting, in which it said, we're going to set up a special commission to deal with all these, you know, issues of frisson that we potentially have on the IRA. So is the relationship so mature on these real significant issues that matter, that in the middle of a Ukraine war where nothing is more important than this idea of unity and Western, you know, holding together stronger than ever, is the relationship so mature that we can allow ourselves to have these public moments of conflict when we've already created diplomatic avenues to solve them? Is that good for the public idea and impression of the transatlantic relationship or not? Or is this just part of how we churn ourselves back together again?
I think it doesn't do much harm, because in comparison to what Germany and the US are doing together in Ukraine right now, and also on China, the very significant turn that this German government, in comparison to the last government, has taken in its stance on China, these are minor issues from my perspective. And I think what's different too is that in the past, also under Merkel, I think, the transatlantic relationship also had like a romantic streak to it. So Angela Merkel was very sentimental about the United States. When you remember her being awarded with the Medal of Freedom by Obama, I think in 2011, she was really moved by this moment. And this is gone. And I think this government, as much as Biden and Scholz have in common, the German government is much cooler in defining its interests when it comes to the IRA, when it comes to its diverging interests in China. And I agree, it's mostly about the pace. It's not the direction, but it's about the pace. How fast do we go, and what policies, how fast are the policies that we implement? Because what we see in the China strategy, or the leaked China strategy, is really minor instruments if they remain in there at all in the final document. But I think these are technical things that can be sorted out, and I see the willingness on both sides, also on the IRA. Take this to the Tech and Technology Council. American officials have said publicly, and in background conversations with journalists, we are very ready to open this up. We are still in the process of interpreting this law. We will find ways of making this work for the Europeans. And also the rhetoric when Habeck and Le Maire came back from that visit to Washington was very much soothing down the conflict. So I don't think this will create a major rupture in the transatlantic relationship, given that the romantic streak is gone, but we have that larger security question that just, as you said, just keeps it all together.
So, Melissa, I want to ask you one short question. You get to leave.
I was going to say, when are you going to kick me off?
This is right now. Right now. I'm kicking you off right now. Well done. Applause for Mark Fisher. Which means that, again, I have an open seat, and I will continue with the Joe Nye method of cold calling people, because now I can finally see folks. But we're going to go ahead and bring up someone from the Aspen Institute. So go ahead. Join us. Melissa, in the meantime, filibustering here, but let me ask you a short question. I had lunch with a colleague of ours in the journalistic profession who will remain unnamed. You've all spoken to how we're working out these issues, but what runs against all of this is a factor of time. I had breakfast yesterday with a number of Chinese senior officials who were here in advance of Wang Ji's visit to the Munich Security Conference, and they underlined again, on the situation of Taiwan that since the 90s they have non-cessation legislation, and they're watching this all very carefully. And again, depending, and we'll go back to Ukraine in just a second, depending on how this ultimately shakes out, China's watching timing very closely. And so everything that Anna has explained, what Mark has detailed, that might work if we have 2, 3, 5, 6 years to kind of work this out, and the German companies can do China +1 strategies, et cetera. But what if the penny drops and the United States says, okay, we need major sanctions by the Europeans on a Taiwan issue, depending on how deep the incursion is? This colleague of ours, who will remain unnamed, said Germany goes with China. Does Germany go with China?
I have no earthly idea, to be completely honest. I mean, if you look at where we're at on Ukraine, right? I think everybody would have said Germany goes with Russia at the outset beforehand. Yeah. Because Germany had no choice, because otherwise Germany was going to freeze, and because Germany and Russia, it's a thing, right? I mean, I honestly don't know, but I don't think you can just predict these things that easily, because I think when push comes to shove, and this is what makes the transatlantic relationship so fascinating, there is something really vital and often unspoken there, particularly, I feel, after many years of being here, from the Germans to the United States. And if they would be ready to rupture that for what ultimately would be purely economic interests. It would not be that we respect the same rule of law and have the same view on human rights. I'm not so sure.
Well, I mean, we'll all be reminded of 2 years ago, the Kaaba Foundation did the survey, and it was the first time that apparently the German public, who they asked, was equidistant on the United States and China, with obviously the scars of the Trump years still behind it. And for me, as Stormy said, as a born transatlanticist, I will tell you from my personal experience, that really sent shivers down my spine for all of the systemic reasons you've just mentioned. Elizabeth has joined us. Elizabeth, how are you thinking about these issues? China pressures, but also the emotional piece in the transatlantic relationship, maybe.
I think I have to skip the question because I have another question, actually.
Oh, please.
I was looking towards this book and power change, and I asked myself, looking ahead to the US elections, how stable is the relation between the US and Germany and the EU if we have a power change in or domestic political unrest in the US? So, and also we have global challenges that really exceed the legislation period of democratic states. And I was wondering if you have any answer or outlook towards the trouble we could face if there is maybe political change or domestic unrest.
Anna, and how much are the German authorities gaming this already with your insight into Berlin policymaking? What are options for 2024?
Hard to say. I think there's just a lot of, just as in the China question, there's a lot of hoping that it won't happen, not really having an alternative at hand. And so going forward as if the doom wasn't there. So I don't think Germany's really prepared for another disruptive Trump administration that is undoing all the green transformation, all the transformation on China, might undo even policies towards Russia or Ukraine. I don't think there's a clear answer by the German government because there is no good answer for the German government. We're just so dependent on the military support, on the good economic relations, particularly now that economic relations with Germany's second largest trading partner, China, are worsening. So I think it will be a sort of a muddling through if it happens and hoping for the best. That's how I feel.
Melissa, are you seeing any prep? Are the Germans talking more to American governors as power shifts down to the next level, as things are shifting around? What's the contact with Republicans? The story mentioned yesterday, the biggest congressional delegation in the history of the Munich Security Conference will show up in the Bavarian capital tomorrow, and that'll be a mixed group. So
that'll be interesting.
What would you hope from that conversation on Elizabeth's question?
I think there's more, obviously. I mean, I remember before the Trump election, like speaking to a group in the Bundestag from the SPD, and people were just, lawmakers were coming up to me saying, he's not really going to get elected, right? and there was this mixture of fear and hope in their voice. And I think that element, like the idea that Germany needs to be prepared for that, is more realistic. Again, they're buying for time, thinking, okay, we just see with Nikki Haley, the very first, potential challengers to Trump throwing their hats in the ring, and it's just now starting to gear up. But I think the approach is much more realistic. That also some of the things that are being put in place, some of the policies that are being put in place, to not just let them be at the whim of the president. Obviously, with something like Paris, you can't change that. With Paris Climate Accords, but there being this understanding that the ties at the congressional level need to be deeper. But it's just, I think we're just at the beginning of that, and it definitely. I'm just going to say Trump 2.0 presidency could be a real disruptor. Like that, I don't think anyone, would dispute. But the question would be, is Germany now having been through Trump 1.0, better prepared and also better able to take on a leadership role in the West than it was. I mean, because Merkel never wanted that. It was always, she's now waving the flag, and it was like, no, I'm German, I can't do that. And we see with Russia, unfortunately, where that led.
Elizabeth, because you mentioned Anna's book, and there is a new generation of power, at least leading the parties. From your generational vantage point, would a German leadership elite be better prepared because they've seen what can happen across the Atlantic? They see how major changes in an economy and a culture, wokeness is a thing that's come over here that's very ill-defined and very poorly understood, but it's beginning to have its impact on cultural discussions here. Do you think that society is preparing for another shift in the United States?
I cannot speak, I think, for my whole generation, but I feel culturally there's still a very a look towards the US, and culture is accepted, or the dominance of the US is accepted in terms of also wokeness and these terms. But politically, I feel like even younger people are becoming more aware what are European values and how do we differ and what other partners are at hand. And I think the struggle and fight of the Ukraine has impressed many, and also that war is actually happening again. And this was kind of also waking up, because my parents tell me about '89 and also about the threat of nuclear attacks, and we have been very far away from this, and this was kind of, an awakening that we are not after history, but we live in times of conflict, and I think the US has become a partner which is not really reliable. Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting because I know, your generation in the United States, I don't think the reality of war is as palpable because it's just simply so far away. And what that does to the younger generation, I find, really interesting how that will play out.
Okay, I'm getting pointers. Oh, fantastic. Joanna, you want to come up? Can we do musical chairs?
Thank you, Elizabeth.
As is our Fishbowl model. Sorry, I'm making you put all your technology away in order to do that. We want to, at some point, just before we end, and we're about 15 minutes out, circle back to Ukraine. But Joanna, we've just heard this sort of intergenerational perspective on leadership, on movements within the United States and here that could kind of influence the way that we look at the strength of the relationship. What's your take?
Well, I just raised my hand because I really wanted. Whoops,
microphone.
Sorry. I just raised my hand because I really wanted to comment on that question because it's super important. And one of the things that's interesting, we always have to remember with all governments, when we think about China, when we think about the U.S., it's not homogenous. And I believe the current administration recognizes how that in many ways the EU project is better aligned with American, what I would say is American, at least their interests and their values, and mine too. But anyway, and so therefore they're actually actively working in a policy way to make the EU less dependent on the U.S. Because they recognize we need to be partners. We need to be able to prop each other up when bad things happen. And so I think that's something the current present administration acknowledges.
So now that I have you here, okay, now I'm going to show my own colors. I thought it was a particularly clever tactic to, quote unquote, deploy governors of very conservative states to Davos, who were all there to raise money for their own states. And my favorite part of Davos was Brian Kemp, who's the governor of the state of Georgia, saying, well, the governor doesn't really believe in man-made climate change, but he does believe that Georgia is open for business. And I think this is particularly clever on the IRA, because this idea that if you give them business, if the infrastructure plans puts new bridges, new roads in states, how are the Republicans going to refuse that? And you saw some of that in the State of the Union address when the president made the entire halls of Congress stand up and clap for seniors, and then said, now we're not going to cut Medicaid, are we? Medicare, are we? And so I thought, there's some clever competition play seemingly going on in the Biden administration, but I'm not sure if that outlasts toward a 2024 election. What's your take?
Could I just say that your observation is a beautiful mirroring of what Professor Newman just said too, about which I hadn't heard before, about that the two sides, when you have trade, it changes both. So I love this idea of like, let's throw the GOP into Germany and see if something changes if they make some business.
So we might have a resume on Monday, quote unquote, of the GOP. The GOP goes to Munich, and we'll see how that shifts, and Davos and any place else. We'll see how that goes. But Anna, we'll do one more round on the China piece. But this GOP in Congress has a new committee on China. And as you saw about the balloon debate, I mean, they would have sooner shot the thing up over Montana, and, so be it. And so, there's a lot more harshness on the China question, a lot more push, a lot more speed on anti-China policies, the way that we had rhetoric in the Cold War. How dangerous is that for the Germans, or does that feel dangerous to them as, again, we think about 2024?
I wouldn't say dangerous, but I think what not just Germany but other European countries see is that they are sort of entrenched in the middle, and that it's hard to make an independent decision along to their interests, independent of the United States. And I think since we've discussed the Huawei question in Germany, there hasn't been, at least not in my perception, Melissa will maybe know better, like a lot of pressure on a very concrete policy in Germany where the United States wanted to push Germany in a certain direction. But we see it with other European states when it comes to the CHIPS Act and embargoes for machinery to go to China that could produce high-end chips. We now see the Netherlands and Japan buying into that deal. Yep. And Germany hasn't been on the list yet, as far as I can see, in any of these policies. But of course, it could happen any time if the United States defines a certain interest that involves Germany. So I think it will be very hard to have what, in my view, the administration is trying to have its own China policy, which is, as we said, slower and thus independent of the United States, or they are seeking a certain independence of what the United States is doing. But of course, if the pressure grows with a different administration and much harder policies, as you've mentioned, it might be a completely different field. Yeah.
I think it's useful to bring up this piece that, of course, and DCM Price mentioned it, this idea that we would try to have clean networks, that this was something that the Trump administration pushed through NATO, that would be sort of a deliverable, deliverable for NATO nations, that we have networks clean of Chinese technology. And I'll remind the audience that telecom has had since 2019 a deal with Chinese telecom providers, which effectively means with the Chinese government, that even if the U.S. put sanctions on telecommunication equipment, German Telecom would still want to continue buying that kind of technology from China, which just raises a point that we heard from Anu Bradford, I think articulated beautifully in the start of this conversation here yesterday, this conference, which is that all of us now have to negotiate vertically with our own technology companies and with our own telecoms companies, and that in addition to everything that we've been discussing from a state-to-state level in the transatlantic relationship, there's a new set of actors that will begin to dominate our security questions and concerns and capabilities ultimately. And that's, by the way, what we'll be discussing as part of our Futures Forum event tomorrow at the Munich Security Conference. So if you're in Munich, come along. Joanna, thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing up a couple of those points. All right, I think we can do one more rotation. We'll bring up... Yes, well, I hope we can hear you. Are you sure you don't want to come and join us? Please come and join us. That way we've had a fully gender equal representation. I like that.
You get the mic.
Thank you. I'm Peter Arendt. I used to be active in international banking. As you can see from my gray hair, I used to be active in international banking. But I have the privilege of having observed German-American relations for around 60 years or so. And let me make this remark. on the topics here. It has a strong cynical aspect that it needed the Ukraine war to send a wake-up call to German politics and to the German government. And you know as well as I do, the German government provided a U-turn in German politics. And I was absolutely pleased to see that politicians who had dwelled on their leftist dreams and ideology overnight landed in reality. And I think it was an American politician a few months ago who cynically said, well, the Germans did a perfect job after the Second World War. They gladly enjoyed the safety umbrella of the United States, built their economy and their standard of living, and well, in German we say, yesterday Steilvorlage was used. It is Friede, Freude, Eierkuchen Politik. That means peace, fun, joy, and pancake.
Yeah, who wouldn't want that?
And we can only keep our fingers crossed looking at the geopolitical global situation, which has changed. I think that all we can agree on that. Not talking about Taiwan and things like that. So the world has changed,
yes.
I think. And so German politics have reacted, and I can only hope that they accept their responsibility to play a visible role and to join forces with the United States and the rest of the EU.
Have you been disappointed by what happened after the Zeitenwende speech, the pace of it, the public debate?
To tell you the truth, not very disappointed, because I have watched the scene for decades, as I mentioned. And I criticize the German government, but of course you've got to see that they have to come a long way, and this U-turn, this positive U-turn I mentioned, is already an achievement in its own right. And so we have to be realistic. They will not be able to change everything overnight, but the important thing is the strong will and the determination to do so. And I fully understood Scholz with regard to the Adams issues, tanks. He needed the argument of, we have done this in full
covering partnership,
and he used this issue as a strong argument for his being reluctant in the early days. Okay,
I'm really glad you joined us, because this allows us to finish up on the question of Ukraine, if you will, but to talk about some of the things we as dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticists often don't want to see in this country. We'll see it apparently out in force on the 25th of September. A latent anti-Americanism, a growing anti-Americanism. We've seen some of the arguments that, oh, isn't the United States profiting from this war because now Europe is buying its LNG and has to buy its military equipment off the shelf, and the United States are building ammunition and putting together ammunition at the fastest rate since the Korean War. Doesn't that make us more beholden to the States? You know, this sort of anti-Americanism that somebody put it glibly as, you know, the Germans will never forgive the Americans for their own liberation and their own democracy. I mean, this bizarre idea that there are still parts of this society, and they've become vociferous in part because of how the Chancellor has led, you know, offering a clear line on February 24th, but then, you know, sort of not creating the leadership-containing environment that sort of clamped down on that kind of debate. That, you know, I grew up in the 80s around the NATO-Doppelbeschluss, where in Wiesbaden, you know, on the bridges, it would say, "Ami, go home." So let's use these last couple minutes to dig into something that's slightly painful, which is to say, given that, you know, we're trying to move things forward in Ukraine, what is our joint objective on Ukraine, Germans and Americans? And then how do we deal with these societal breakages in the discussion, particularly in Germany, on Ukraine? Anna.
I'm not sure anti-Americanism is growing. I think it's always there. It's there on the left and on the extreme right. And we see it resurfacing now, of course, in the debate on what's a good policy in Ukraine. I think that Germany in particular has shown that it is able to create societal cohesion in this war, because we have seen so many projections of an autumn of discontent with masses on the streets, when people start freezing at home. And none of this has materialized, even though we really can't say that the extreme left and the extreme right in Germany haven't tried to bring people to the streets, to mobilize. They really did try, and it just didn't happen. Of course, part of this is that Germany was capable and also lucky enough to cushion the most harshest effects, economic effects of this crisis through direct payments to their citizens, to making energy, peaking energy prices a little less harsh on the German population. But I think it's also, and that is the good side of Scholz's step-by-step approach, they also took the time to let it sink in German society, and they were really able to build a majority. And now that the tanks are delivered, just before the decision, we had an evenly split population on the tank question. And when he said, okay, we'll do it, he got people on his side.
Right.
I mean, a majority was pro the delivery. So that's for the German side, and maybe Melissa can talk to the American side.
I would just say, I feel like the anti-Americanism has always been here since reunification. I'm just going to say, you know, that it's always kind of swimming around and different things cause it to raise up, and we're seeing it raise up now again with some of the tensions over the IRA, with, you know, around the energy question. My favorite question that I'll get is, you know, oh, you Americans just want to sell us your gas, you know, like the Russians were giving it to you for free or something, and had no agenda otherwise. And these are the kind of things that still come up. What I think is interesting is actually on the flip side, what I think in Germany has not yet fully been internalized is the image of Germany that has changed in the United States, where there is a certain anti-Germanism, if you will, where Germans are seen as super wealthy freeloaders. This obviously during the Trump administration was, you know, going on and on and on about the trade Überschuss, and you start to hear people saying, oh wow, you have free health care in Germany, right? Because it's always talked about as being free, as though nobody pays for it. And then, you know, like there being a certain level of tensions that come up with this idea that the Germans are truly just freeloading off the Americans, and why should we have to pay for them anymore? And I think under the Trump administration, that sentiment really was seeded, and in some places, you know, it is died out, but in other places, it's taken root. And that was something that back in the day when Germany was seen as the home, which the Germans all hated, but I said, you know, be careful what you wish for, seen as the home of lederhosen and Brezel and beer and Munich Oktoberfest, and it was like oh, that's a terrible cliche. It's like, well, this is your alternative. And you know, we see some of that like playing out a little bit in you know, talks that take place at a higher level as well.
Yes, please, go ahead. We'll finish after that.
Two more aspects, please. Once again,
good, we can do one more. Yes, go
Germany and its population was driven by economic aspects, by wishful thinking, and my question would be, what's going to happen when the Russians successfully invaded and overturned the Ukraine? Or will, this is still part of the possibility that that the Western support will not be quick enough to secure that the Ukraine survives. So what's going to happen then? And will they go to the Baltic states next, Poland, and so on? And this is no negative exaggeration. This is
No, these
reality.
are very real scenarios.
And so that's why I'm saying, and I'm not the only one, of course, the world has changed in the last 12 months or so.
Yeah. Peter, thank you for being here. We'll toss this back to our audience. We have one more person who can come up and join us, and that person is you. No, we have a microphone for you here, but we want to have you as part of our round. I've just been allowed one more. So Peter, you're excused, and we're going to do our Fishbowl musical chairs here. Melissa, while our new guest gets settled, that is, I think, the essential question, that we're all going to ask ourselves. We're going to ask ourselves in Munich over and over again, how does this end? How do you think about this? How do you talk about with your reporting colleagues, who are, by the way, doing really enormous work in Ukraine? So she's mic'd.
Yeah, I'm mic'd. But thank you. Well, the reporting colleagues are really, on the day-to-day. How does this end? I feel like we haven't gotten to that question yet. Like, now that we're a year in, it's starting to be like the longer term. I think certainly here, from my perspective, being in Germany, looking at this, it was so much like, how do we get through this? And how do we even come full circle on this Zeitenwende and this U-turn and accept that, okay, now we've made the turn, and only then can we get where do we go from here? But I think that is certainly going to be one of the crucial questions going forward, accepting that something irrevocable has broken with Russia. And this idea of saying, yes, but when we speak to them, the Germans keep, certain German politicians will keep bringing that up, and that we need to be thinking about how we bring Russia back into this. And nobody is prepared yet to think about that. But ultimately, that is going to be, the million-dollar question in terms of this one. Unfortunately, I think if you look at the United States, like, I'm just going to say Afghanistan exit, we are not world champions in thinking how are things going to end.
Hans-Jochen Schmidt has joined us. Introduce yourself briefly and plunge right in.
Former civil servant of the Foreign Office. I think the question is, we are lacking a strategy concerning Ukraine. This morning, I had a look in Le Monde, and there's an article, I forgot now the author, that say we have certainly a kind of difficulty to develop a strategy. And Heusgen, I think he underlined that recently, that we try to come over with red lines. For example, okay, now we agreed upon delivering maybe tanks. And that is more or less the last. And that is extremely dangerous. It's a vicious circle. But I wanted only to refer to, that's a long time ago, leadership, what is it, in partnership. And we have not been able to live up to that. And what worries me at the moment, that we, inside the European Union, we have certain difficulties. And we have not anymore Great Britain. Let's say we have, to get an agreement with Macron. And between Germany and France, I think there are enormous difficulties, not to, we have to put more, interest in developing the European aspect. And there, I think there is a lack. And there is a lack concerning politicians too, that say it's fantastic that we have the United States, but you said if the perspective maybe is a different one and there's a change, let's say what we're doing then inside the European Union, are we strong enough? We are not strong enough, of course. Let's say if, for example, the French immediately they are angry that we delivered, we now agreed upon getting the F-15. But I think it's the only way. And let's say we have to position ourselves and to come out stronger in taking being aware that we need to be more responsible as a leader inside the European Union, and not we are afraid of because of our past. And that is, I think, a criticism I think we have to take more into our consideration.
It's a good piece to end on. What are European interests? Because I'll remind you that this week in Munich, we were supposed to be debating German interests in the German national security strategy. Do we have it? No. Do we know what German interests are? Perhaps no. Anna, what are our European interests and how are we going to forge them together?
And just to underline, yesterday we had what is a short reference to our national strategy, and somebody said it will be adopted. I have enormous doubts, because we, inside even our German government, we don't agree. The same with China. Let's say we have 2 China strategies. And then in agreement with France, it's even more difficult. Let's say we have to find at least inside and then with France in order to live up. Because the United States, it's great to rely on the United States, but as you said, the United States expects that we take up more our leadership role.
Anna, how are we going to do it? Well done.
Well, I think I wouldn't be sitting here and I'd earn a lot more money if I knew how this is going to end. I think on the strategy question, I do think Germany doesn't have a strategy. I think the first year, as Minister said, was risk mitigation, dealing with the fallout here in this country, dealing with putting together a political coalition within Germany to deliver weapons. And now we're at a point, and this is why the Munich Security Conference is a very interesting one, I think, is where everybody is sitting down, taking a deep breath, looking around, and I think the next big debate will be a strategic one. My impression is that the German government would rather like to go on with the strategy of risk mitigation.
It's the easy one.
Yes, it's the easy one. It might not be the better one in the long term. If we have a destabilized Ukraine with some sort of contact line still running through it for the next how many years, and the constant threat of an attack, this country will not recover. We can put all the money in there for reconstruction we want. If Putin looms in the background at some contact line, this will not be a healthy European country, as everybody is now rhetorically saying they want it to be. But still, I think Germany remains in the risk mitigation camp. But I think there will be others, for example, the British and of course Poland and the Baltics, who will push for a different strategy and to come together and find that. I don't see it right now how it can work. I don't know whether the German government can be moved to adopt some other strategy and what would take it. That's what I'm expecting to be the big debate this year, and also at the Munich Security Conference. But I don't know how it ends, really. I really don't know.
Well, we'll watch the few days in Munich very closely, whether you're there or you're streaming things from the main hall, from the comfort of your own living room. It will dominate the debate, no doubt, beyond the 3 days that many of us will be in Munich. Please join me in thanking this excellent permanent panel.
Can I just
Melissa
throw in
has
a
one
real
more
quick thought on the
thought.
whole idea of the need for Germany to be stronger within Europe and the Franco-German relationship? 100% agree, and I think that the United States actually wants that as well. But I think you mentioned Poland, and I think Poland, we have seen in this past year, is a player. Like, I hate the old Weimar Dreieck as much as anybody, because it seems like you go to there and like nothing comes out of it. But it exists, and maybe it's time. And there's another transatlantic relationship between the Poles and the Americans that is nowhere near as storied as the German one, but there's a certain military strength inherent in that one that for Europe and Germany as well could be a crucial piece into the puzzle of moving forward on a cohesive European strategy.
We could go many rounds more on this, and now that you're all with us, certainly with you all as well. But for now, please join me in thanking Anna and Melissa. But then, since we're sort of in an American vernacular, Peter, Hans-Jochen, Elisabeth, Joanna, and Mark for this wonderful discussion.